Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. On Sunday, July 21st in 2019, the Chicago Tribune published an extensive article by Ron Rossman, which observed that 100 years earlier, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and Chicago Daily News reporter Carl Sandburg had predicted that post-World War I American social tensions would result in racial conflict, as did, of course, take place and has continued at intervals of time throughout the whole of the 20th century as well as into the first quarter of the 21st. To a large degree, Sandburg, according to Rossman, attributed this particular circumstance to the fact that United States President Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed the global conflict of World War I to be a war to make the world safe for democracy. But after seeing action on European battlefields and returning to their segregated home country for African American veterans who had, in Rossman's words, served alongside French troops who respected them as comrades in arms, the dream deferred feelings, as expressed some 32 years later by founding Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes, had become ready to explode. Of course, had Sandburg peered a bit further into his crystal ball of societal trends, he might have also identified gender, the war between the sexes, as an additional issue that was going to press forward in the suffragette movement, resulting in the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1920, giving women the right to vote, in addition to the continued push towards enfranchisement that eventually culminated in the Civil Rights Act in 1964. In terms of poetry, with the discovery of Langston Hughes, who'd been working as a busboy in Washington, D.C., by the highly theatrical celebrity performance poet Vachel Lindsay, the contemporary concept of DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, began to be demanded by generations of writers, joining such inheritors of Ralph Waldo Emerson's call for an independent American poetry and Walt Whitman's efforts to establish it, as did Sandburg within the Chicago-based Poetry magazine at the beginning of World War I in 1914 with his poem Chicago. And then Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Vachel Lindsay in a protracted chorus of voices which would eventually come to include a long and highly diverse list of others. Following the lead of Whitman's hearing America singing the very chorus of workers laboring to build a post-Civil War nation, Carl Sandburg first championed the industrialized hog butcher for the world city that works in a modernist, free verse departure from the imagery of romantic poetry, proclaiming, "Come, show me another city with head lifted, so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, flinging metallic curses amid the toil of piling job on job." Sandburg then gathered together a genuine American song bag consisting of ballads, spirituals, work and folk songs like John Henry, to be included within the varied poetic voices of the United States of America. From out of this same Great War era, there additionally began to be become a deceptively straightforward yet highly complex chronicle of country life on Robert Frost's New Hampshire farm, with his famous stopping by woods on a snowy evening, the road not taken, and the observations both that good fences make good neighbors, and that a poem should begin in delight and end in wisdom. Unlike Langston Hughes, who lived until 1967, as explained by Louis Ottenmeyer in Lives of the Poets, Vachel Lindsay, the bronco that would not be broken, after having proclaimed himself the voice of democracy, as well as the gutter dream and the golden dream, 2 years following the 1929 stock market crash and beginning of the Great Depression, drank a bottle of Lysol and died. Langston Hughes, however, for the next 36 years, championed diversity and inclusion among American poetic voices, incorporating the rhythms of jazz and blues within his verse, and reaching back well beyond Walt Whitman and Emerson to the themes of the colonial black female poet Phyllis Wheatley, who, as early as 1773, had written on being brought from Africa to America, "Remember Christians, Negroes as black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." Within a verse titled "I Too," Hughes evoked both Wheatley and Whitman's "I Hear America Singing," stating, "I too sing America. I am the darker brother. I too am America." Then, in a poem called "Heritage" by Harlem Renaissance poet Conti Cullen, he began by questioning, "What is Africa to me?" and continued, "I belong to Jesus Christ, preacher of humility," later commenting, "Lord, forgive me if my need sometimes shapes a human creed, wishing he I served were black," and ending by saying, "Not yet has my heart or head realized they and I are civilized." Also, during the time of racial struggle Carl Sandburg had predicted, including the lynchings which inspired Billie Holiday's lyric for her song "Strange Fruit," the black poet Conti Cullen would write, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot," concluding, "Like men we'll face the murderous pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back." It was in his collected poems of 1926 that former military ambulance driver Edward Estlin, E.E. Cummings, attacked the empty patriotic political type of rhetoric which had sent 53,000 Americans to their deaths in World War I combat, not to mention the additional 63,000 who died from the Spanish flu, asserting, "Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of pilgrims," and so forth. "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early my country 'tis of centuries come and go and are no more? What of it? We should worry? In every language, even deaf and dumb, thy sons acclaim your glorious name, by Gory, by Jingo, by G, by gosh, by gum. Why talk of beauty What could be more beautiful than these heroic, happy dead who rushed like lions to the roaring slaughter? They did not stop to think. They died instead. Then, should the voice of liberty be mute, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. With regard to assertions arising from the social changes following the 1918 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month armistice, which suspended conflict at the end of World War I, the woman who Nancy Milford termed savage beauty in her bestseller, The Life of Edna St. Vincent Millay, expressed a new emancipation emerging within the war between the sexes during the Prohibition razzle-dazzle bootleg gin roaring 20s jazz age by proclaiming in her poetry, "My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But my foes and oh, my friends, it gives such a lovely light." And then Marianne Moore was to say of poetry itself, "I too dislike it. There are things more important beyond this fiddle." Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Additionally, in 1926, Archibald MacLeish published a somewhat absurdist poem titled "The End of the World," predicting, after the blowing away of a circus big top, a sudden blackness, the black pall of nothing, nothing, nothing at all. Within the next 2 decades following the Great Depression, with Hart Crane's marveling at the lend a myth to God engineering achievement of the Brooklyn Bridge, as well as his man overboard Gulf of Mexico suicide, the top would in fact blow off during the Second World War. Randall Jarrett ending his Flying Fortress poem, The Death of the Bell Turnet Gunner, stating, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose." At the same time, in moral opposition to the rationale of American saturation bombing of civilians within the cities of Western Europe, Robert Lowell went to prison for several months as a conscientious objector, in his writing trending away from free verse towards more traditional structured forms. But then, post-World War II poets, exhausted by decades of economic collapse, Dust Bowl, Hallelujah Bum folk music, and renewed global conflict, the Beats would find their unrestrained free verse inspiration in Allen Ginsberg's Best Minds of His Generation Destroyed by Madness, Howl, as published in 1956. Just a year before, Man in a Gray Flannel Suit, Hartford Accident Indemnity Insurance Company executive, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird poet, Wallace Stevens, had won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize in the same year that he died. Ginsberg's Howl was published by fellow poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti from his City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, resulting, like the Shakespeare and Company bookstore publication of James Joyce's novel Ulysses some 30 years before, in the arrest of the publisher, confiscation of printed copies of the work, and charges of disseminating obscene literature before it too, like Joyce's novel, was eventually determined to be not inherently obscene. Then, within an American song bag of rock and roll and folk music, having gained mainstream baby boomer popularity in January of 1961, Robert Frost obliquely echoed Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land" when telling those assembled on the steps of the U.S. Congress for John F. Kennedy's inauguration as the 35th President of the United States, "The land was ours before we were the land's." That same month, at the age of 19, folk and later rock musician Bob Dylan, who was given the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, began to perform his work in New York City's Greenwich Village. And later that year, the highly confessional voice of Sylvia Plath was described by Robert Lowell as something imaginary, newly, wildly, and subtly created within the introduction to her posthumously published volume of poetry, Ariel, as overseen by her estranged husband, eventual British poet laureate Ted Hughes, following a second, and this time successful, suicide attempt, the circumstances of which were depicted in the 2004 motion picture Sylvia, featuring Gwyneth Paltrow and future James Bond actor Daniel Craig. Within her poetry, Plath combined stunning imagery derived from the atrocities of the Second World War with an intimate personal quality. In the poem Lady Lazarus, for example, she describes her skin with the simile as bright as a Nazi lampshade. And in Daddy, deeply conflicted about her beekeeping father's abandonment of her due to death when she was 10 years old, Plath compares her deceased father to a vampire Luftwaffe Nazi, saying, as she described in her autobiographical book, The Bell Jar, "At 20, I tried to die and get back to you," further explaining, "but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue," ending the poem, "Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through." Then, as described in a Chicago Tribune article, a Chicago Sun-Times article from 1999 on February 11th, 1963, while her children slept in another room, Sylvia Plath, age 30, laid her head on a cloth in an oven and turned on the gas. A former classmate with Sylvia Plath in a poetry course taught by Robert Lowell at Harvard University, Anne Sexton, also provided a kind of feminine mystique perspective within her confessional work, following the suggestion of her psychiatrist, and in volumes like To Bedlam and Part Way Back and The Death Notebooks, Sexton chronicled her struggles as a suburban housewife and mother during the 1950s and 60s, finally ending her life following divorce on Friday, October 4th, 1974, when, as stated by Diane Wood in her biography of the poet, Anne Sexton, glass of vodka in hand, asphyxiated herself and her red Mercury Cougar within a tightly sealed garage. Also, overlapping the second half of the 20th century during a career that began in the 1940s and included the first winning of the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry by an African American in 1950, Gwendolyn Brooks additionally addressed a kind of death urge among young pool-playing black urban males in a straightforward 8-line poem. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Brooks addressed the African American experience from within Chicago's Great Migration, Bronzeville, South Side, and she even taught poetry to members of the Blackstone Rangers street gang, as well as becoming the poet laureate of the state of Illinois from 1968 until the end of her life in the year 2000. Also addressing the Chicago urban experience, although from a white working class perspective, as well as being a spoken word popularizer of poetry, which has caused a movement that's grown from the near Northwest Side bar called the Get Me High Lounge, once attended by 39th President of the United States, James Earl Carter, and his wife, Rosalind, and then moving to a North Side one-time Al Capone hangout called the Green Mill, where he established the Uptown Poetry Slam. Former construction worker Mark Kelly Smith has generated, over a period of more than 3.5 decades, a movement. It's brought countless of new voices into the mix of poetic expression, including such people as late American Book Award winning Ojibwe poet E. Donald Two Rivers, and the inaugural state of Massachusetts poet laureate Reggie Gibson. With national poetry slams that have filled such venues as the Chicago Theater and the Skyline Stage on the city's Navy Pier, there have come to be poetry slams in several nations around the world, even gaining for Smith the honor of being made a Chevalier of the Republic of France. Within his first published volume of verse that I designed and released from Collage Press after he had been conducting the Poetry Slam for over a decade, Mark Smith addressed himself to Carl Sandburg in a poem titled Smith to Sandburg, Sandburg to Smith, commenting, "They told him you were wicked, hook-pinned. He saw painted women under the gas lamps luring farm boys. I see hot crack tricks prowling almost naked on Dearborn, pulling North Shore football heroes upstairs to $50 rooms for $30 wipes of their runny noses. And they said to him, you are crooked. Crooked you still are. Crooked at the top, crooked in the middle, crooked at the bottom, where maybe you should be crooked, where maybe there's an excuse for being crooked, where gunmen still kill and go free to kill again. For those at the crooked top, for those in the crooked middle, too moral to pull the triggers themselves. Well, anyway, I guess the point of all of this is that poetry in the United States continues, as it has for over a century, to consistently embrace new voices, to expand in its perspectives, and to add to an American varied chorus of expression. It has come to be increasingly inclusive and diverse. And my guess is that this process will continue to broaden and expand in the future. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.